Good morning, everyone. Today I want to talk about a transformation that is larger than real estate, larger than technology, larger than any single company, brokerage, or business model. I want to talk about access, because throughout history, access has always determined influence. Those who had access to information, opportunities, and markets often held the advantage. They could see what others couldn't see. They could act before others could act. And they could make decisions with a level of confidence that others simply didn't have. For generations, consumers depended on professionals to bridge that gap. If you wanted information, you often had to go through someone who already had it. If you wanted visibility into the market, you relied on those who controlled access to that visibility. But the world changed. Technology changed. Consumer expectations changed. And perhaps most importantly, information changed. Today, consumers can access more information in a few minutes than previous generations could access in weeks. They can research neighborhoods, compare prices, analyze trends, and educate themselves before ever speaking with a professional. That shift has fundamentally changed the balance of power, and that's what this presentation is really about. The consumer finally decides, not because professionals no longer matter, but because consumers now have the ability to participate in the process from a position of knowledge, confidence, and choice. This is Steve Koleno, and this is Confidential Remarks. To understand where we are today, we first have to understand the system that existed before. For decades, real estate operated behind closed doors. Information was not widely available. Data was not instantly searchable. Market knowledge was often fragmented and difficult to access. Consumers didn't have the tools we take for granted today. There were no real-time listing platforms available at the touch of a button. There were no property alerts delivered instantly to a smartphone. There were no online reviews, digital market reports, or AI-powered search tools helping people evaluate options. The professional served as the primary source of information because that information simply wasn't available elsewhere. And again, this wasn't necessarily good or bad. It was simply the reality of the environment. The industry was built around expertise, relationships, and access. Professionals became indispensable because they possessed information that consumers couldn't easily obtain themselves. That model defined real estate for generations. It shaped how transactions occurred, how relationships were built, and how value was perceived throughout the industry. But every industry eventually encounters a moment when the flow of information changes. And when information changes, everything else changes with it. One of the most important truths in business is that information has value, but information becomes even more valuable when not everyone has access to it. When information is scarce, people seek out those who possess it. And that's exactly what happened. For many years, the individuals and organizations that controlled information often controlled the transaction itself. They knew which properties were available. They understood market conditions. They recognized opportunities before they became obvious. They had insights that consumers simply could not access on their own. That informational advantage created influence, and influence created opportunity. The ability to control information often translated directly into economic value. In many ways, information became the currency of the industry. The more access you had, the greater your ability to guide outcomes. The greater your ability to guide outcomes, the more valuable your position became. That's why information became control, and that's why control became profit. Not because people were intentionally withholding value from consumers, but because the system itself rewarded those who possessed information that others did not. For much of modern real estate history, participation often required permission. Consumers couldn't simply access everything themselves. They couldn't independently review every piece of market information. They couldn't instantly compare every available option. They couldn't easily validate what they were hearing. As a result, they relied heavily on professionals to guide every stage of the process. Now, to be fair, many professionals provided tremendous value. They protected clients from mistakes. They offered expertise that consumers genuinely needed. They helped navigate complex transactions. But the structure itself created dependence. The consumer stood outside the gate. The professional stood inside the gate, and access flowed through that relationship. The message wasn't always spoken directly, but it was often implied. If you want access, you need someone to grant it. If you want information, you need someone to provide it. If you want to participate, you need someone to allow you into the process. For decades, that model remained largely unquestioned. Then something happened that changed everything. Then came the internet. And the internet didn't simply improve the existing system. It fundamentally disrupted it. The walls that had protected information began to disappear. Information that once existed behind desks, inside offices, and within private databases suddenly became accessible to millions of people. Consumers could search, compare, research, and learn independently. For the first time, information started moving faster than institutions. The internet didn't ask permission. It didn't respect traditional barriers. It didn't preserve historical gatekeeping structures. Instead, it democratized access. And when access becomes democratized, industries must evolve. The internet gave consumers something they had never possessed at this scale before: visibility. And once people gain visibility, it's very difficult to take it away. The walls didn't slowly weaken, they broke. And the industry entered an entirely new era. As information became public, something important happened. Control shifted. Consumers no longer needed to depend entirely on others to access knowledge. They could investigate properties. They could study neighborhoods. They could review historical data. They could compare options before ever making a phone call. Suddenly, information belonged to everyone. And when everyone has access to information, the value equation changes. The gatekeeper didn't necessarily lose relevance, but the gatekeeper lost exclusivity, and that's a very important distinction. Consumers still need expertise. They still need strategy. They still need guidance. What they no longer need is someone whose value is based solely on controlling information. That era is over. The market became more transparent. Consumers became more informed. And the expectations placed upon professionals began to change dramatically. This is where the real opportunity begins. Because while information has become abundant, clarity remains scarce. Consumers are not struggling because they lack information. They're struggling because they have too much of it. Every day they are flooded with listings, articles, opinions, predictions, advertisements, and conflicting advice. The challenge is no longer access. The challenge is interpretation. The challenge is understanding what matters. The challenge is knowing what to trust. That's why the future belongs to professionals who can create clarity, professionals who can simplify complexity, professionals who can help consumers navigate uncertainty with confidence. The future is not about controlling information. That battle has already been decided. The future is about helping people make sense of information, helping them avoid mistakes, helping them recognize opportunities, helping them move forward with confidence. That is where trust is built. And trust is rapidly becoming the most valuable asset in our industry. When we step back and look at the industry objectively, the transition becomes very clear. The old model was built around access. The new model is built around trust. The old model asks, what information do I control? The new model asks, how well can I help someone understand what they're seeing? The old model created value through exclusivity. The new model creates value through insight. Consumers don't need another gatekeeper. They have search engines, listing platforms, data sources, and endless information at their fingertips. What they need is someone they trust, someone who can help them separate noise from reality, someone who can explain risk, someone who can identify opportunity, someone who can provide perspective when emotions are running high. The future professional isn't a gatekeeper standing in front of a door. The future professional is a trusted guide walking alongside the consumer, and that is a far more powerful role. If we want to understand where consumer expectations are headed, we only need to look at what people are demanding today. They want clarity. They want straightforward answers without unnecessary complexity. They want choice. They want options, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions that align with their goals. They want truth, not spin, not marketing language, not carefully crafted narratives. They want honesty, and they want transparency. They want to understand what they're paying for, what risks exist, and what outcomes are possible. These aren't trends, these are expectations. And organizations that embrace these principles will earn trust. Organizations that resist them will struggle to maintain relevance. Because transparency is no longer optional, it has become the standard. And consumers are rewarding the professionals who recognize that reality. Today, the walls are down. The curtain has been pulled back. The information that once existed in isolated places now exists in the hands of consumers everywhere. And that reality isn't changing. The question is not whether transparency will continue. The question is how we respond to it. We can resist change. We can wish the old system still existed. Or we can embrace the opportunities created by a more informed consumer. Because informed consumers are not the enemy of great professionals. They're the reason great professionals matter more than ever. When information becomes available to everyone, trust becomes the differentiator. When transparency becomes the standard, credibility becomes the advantage. And when consumers have more choices than ever before, guidance becomes incredibly valuable. The future belongs to those who help people make confident decisions. The future belongs to those who earn trust. The future belongs to those who guide rather than control. The walls are down, the curtain is pulled back, and now ultimately the decision belongs where it always should have belonged. You decide. This has been Confidential Remarks.